Afghanistan. The name of the country that sits at the crossroads of Asia conjures up many words: destitution, war, oppression. Afghanistan sits at the 180th spot on the Human Development Index, just below the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and is in the midst of collapsing into extreme poverty. However, this was not always the case. Just 50 years ago, Afghanistan was considered a relatively modern state. Its government was stable, and the economy was growing. So what happened that caused Afghanistan to enter this downward spiral of pain and misery for over 40 long years? Everything changed when the Soviet Union attacked. But why would the Soviet Union attack? Afghanistan was already closely aligned with the Soviet Union, sending thousands of students and army officers to train in Moscow every year. Afghanistan also offered little in terms of strategic advantage and additional natural resources. The vast natural resources present within the country only being surveyed after the invasion took place. So, why then did the Soviet Union invade? Before diving into the reasons for the invasion itself, we should first understand the context within which the invasion stood. After the Second World War, the world was split into two. In one corner stood the United States with their freedom-loving democracies and self-destructive capitalisms. In the other corner stood the Soviet Union, with its God-hating communism and subpar state-run economies. The conflict between these two superpowers was characterized by its non-confrontational nature, where no direct military conflict was engaged in, and instead war was waged through proxies, with the US supporting anyone that stood against communism, whether they be dictators or religious fundamentalists, and the Soviets backing up any communist parties and uprisings, fulfilling their role in the world revolution. This led to the involvement of both superpowers supporting opposing sides in numerous conflicts such as the Korean War, the Angolan Civil War, and the North Yemen Civil War. The two wars that stood at the forefront of the Cold War were the Vietnam War, waged directly by the US, and the Soviet-AFGHAN War. The two wars have many similarities. Both lasted for several years. Both were wars of overwhelming firepower versus local guerrilla forces. Both took place in hostile environments for the invaders. Both wars relied on the superpowers propping up failing regimes. Both wars came to be due to the superpowers' justification of propping up said failing regimes in order to conduct their invasions. Both wars led to massive losses of life, and both wars led to long-lasting negative effects that continue to harm the invaded countries to this day. The key difference between the two wars lies in the ways the invading superpowers were shaken during the course of their said wars and in their aftermaths. The US, after losing the war, suffered from internal strife regarding the war. However, in all, their institutions, economy, and finances remained stable. However, for the Soviet Union, this was far from the case. The war in Afghanistan drained their economy and treasury, especially considering that commodity prices fell during the war, something which the Soviets were highly reliant on. In all, while the US was able to leave Vietnam with relatively minor scratches and bruises, the Soviets' engagement in Afghanistan played a major role in their ultimate collapse just 2 years after the end of the war. This takes us back to the original question: why would the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan? Before diving into the two schools of thought that dominate scholars' discussion about the topic, it would probably be wise to understand the chain of events that led to the Soviet Union's fateful invasion of Afghanistan. Although the connection between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, previously the Russian Empire, goes on for centuries, starting with the Russian conquest of Central Asia, the domino effect of events that led to Afghanistan's utter collapse starts with a man named Muhammad Daoud Khan. On July 17, 1973, Muhammad Zahir Shah, then king of Afghanistan, was spending time on the Italian island of Ischia, famous for its thermal water gardens, in order to recover from hemorrhaging treatment after injuring his eye. With the king out of the country for an extended period of time, Muhammad Daoud Khan, the cousin of the king and the former prime minister who had served from 1953 to 1963, took the opportunity to put into action the plans that he had been brewing for nearly a year. With the support of several hundred military officers, Daoud Khan launched a bloodless coup d'etat, in the process abolishing the monarchy and establishing Afghanistan's first republic with himself as the head of state, head of government, the foreign minister, and the head of the army. A key factor of Daoud Khan's coup d'etat was a large communist element within Afghanistan's government, especially within the military. The reason for this is simple and the result of a multi-decade process. In 1893, Afghanistan and the British Raj established the Durand Line, effectively splitting in half the ethnic Pashtun population between Afghanistan and then India. In 1948, however, with the establishment of the newly formed state of Pakistan, tensions quickly flared between Afghanistan and Pakistan concerning the Durand Line, which Afghanistan claimed to no longer recognize. They justified this by claiming that the line was established with the British and, during the partition of India, ethnic Pashtuns within India's borders were only given the option between Pakistan and India, with no option to join Afghanistan. Pakistan, for too many reasons to explain in this video, quickly aligned with the United States, forcing Afghanistan to, in effect, align with the Soviet Union, Afghanistan's northern neighbor. Afghanistan continued to hold itself as a neutral state and attempted to maintain a balance between the Soviet Union and the United States. Every year, Afghanistan would send thousands of students and military officers to train within the Soviet Union, and these individuals were often converted to the Soviets' communist ideology in the process. This resulted in an ever-increasing number of communist intellectuals and army officers in Afghanistan, although it is important to keep in mind here that this phenomenon was relatively isolated in the cities, mainly Kabul, and within upper classes, with the rural populations, the vast majority at the time, remaining uninfluenced by communism. This is important because when Daoud Khan took power, he attempted to strengthen relations with the United States and, simultaneously, recognized that the immense influence held by the communists within Afghanistan's government and military needed to be dealt with, leading to multiple efforts aimed at reducing their power. Unfortunately for Daoud Khan, this effort failed. In 1978, the Sao Revolution took place, removing Daoud Khan from power and replacing the government with an autocratic one-party system led by the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, also known as the PDPA. The coup d'etat included many communist state officials and military officers who had previously supported Daoud Khan, with Daoud Khan and his family subsequently being killed. The new government, led by Hafizullah Amin and Nur Muhammad Taraki, enacted a series of radical modernization reforms backed by suppression of the opposition, brutality, and violence, often cited as the first instance of political repression in Afghanistan's history. The government moved quickly to enforce Marxism on Afghanistan's population, with mass land reform taking place. The primary sticking point was the government's attempt to root out Islam, the religion of the vast majority, and to replace it with Marxist atheism. In essence, it was the war on religion that led to widespread rebellions across the country, with the rebels being labeled mujahideen, those who struggle in the way of God. In the face of such widespread opposition, just a year after gaining power, the PDPA was on the verge of losing control. The Amin government, which had just overthrown and killed Muhammad Taraki, repeatedly called on an agreement signed with the Soviets that allowed Soviet forces to enter Afghan soil, citing the need to provide security and assist in the fight against the Mujahideen. Initially, the call was for military advisors and equipment, but as the rebellion grew in size, so too did Amin's requests. On December 24, 1979, in an effort to prop up the failing PDPA, the Soviet Union sent in the 40th Army and subsequently staged a coup d'etat that installed the Soviet loyalist Babrak Karmal in power. This would be the start of the 9-year-long conflict between the Afghan Mujahideen and the Soviet Union, resulting in the death of countless Afghan civilians and forced millions of refugees to flee from Afghanistan. This, once again, brings us back to the question, why? Why did the Soviet Union invade Afghanistan? The simple answer would be that the Soviet Union believed that they had to prop up a failing communist regime on their own borders in order to save face and show the superiority of communism to the rest of the world. This, however, fails to explain all of the highly intricate nuances surrounding the reasons for war. Is there sufficient justification to appease the international community, no matter how obviously forged it is? What are the benefits of going to war, both short-term and long-term? Can the war even be won? How much manpower and resources will it take for the war to be won? Can the treasury support those costs? Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Can there be a decisive end to the war, or will the war be a slog? These questions, and so many more, surround the decision-making process of any state's attempt or desire to wage war, and, without sufficient answers, war doesn't make any sense. While we may never know the thoughts of the Soviet leadership when they made the final decision to send the 40th Army into Afghanistan, we can attempt to understand some potential reasons for their fateful decision. This, however, is reliant on assumptions. What I mean by this is that one's understanding of a particular context is obviously shaped and influenced by their overall worldview, which is highly influenced by the assumptions one makes. For example, If I make the assumption that power is the driving factor behind human interaction, that will shape my perception of reality and make it lean a certain way. If, on the other hand, I assume that cooperation is a driving factor behind human interactions, although I may see the same particular instances of human interaction as the person who assumes that power is the driving force, I'll reach radically different conclusions. This is often how the study of international relations works. In such a complicated field, there are no clear correct answers. Conclusions are reached by the biases and assumptions of the viewers. This being the case, you won't find it surprising that scholars are mainly divided into two groups regarding the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan. The first group, the constructivists, rely on the assumption that international relations are shaped by history and social relationships. The second group, the realists, instead uphold the dichotomy of power as the main reason for actions on the international field. Before diving into each respective school of thought, it is essential to understand that there is no correct set of assumptions and conclusions. International relations is just human nature writ large, and human nature is one of the, if not the most, complicated topics that anyone has ever dealt with. To attempt to reduce human nature to simple notions such as power and relationships is, in essence, an impossible task. This, nonetheless, does not mean that there is not some merit in focusing on specific aspects of human nature and gaining insight from it. If anything, it is the only real way we can get knowledge about such complicated topics, but it is still important to not lose sight of the forest for the trees. Constructivists work under the assumption that international relations are shaped by history and social relationships instead of power. Under this assumption, constructivist scholars have examined two different areas that concern the start of the war: the ideological differences between the PDPA and the Mujahideen, i.e. why was the entire country rising in revolt, and the social and historical connections between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan. Starting with Pakistan's decision to join the US-sponsored SIDO, in essence joining the US's side of the Cold War, Afghanistan moved in the inverse direction toward its northern neighbor, the Soviet Union, in order to continue to compete for their claims regarding the Durand Line and the Pashtuns that lived within Pakistan's borders. With Pakistan receiving military and economic aid from the US, Afghanistan, in turn, was forced to accept offers of military and economic aid from the Soviet Union, with as many as 300 Soviet scholarships being offered to Afghan students to study in Soviet universities. These actions, occurring nearly 30 years prior to the invasion, laid the foundation for Soviet influence in the country, the eventual rise of the PDPA, and the Soviet subsequent invasion. Constructivists would argue that, without this prior set of events and the relationship that had set up between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union, the reasons for the Soviets' eventual invasion would not exist. This understanding of history and the relationship between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union also serves to explain the reasons for the rise of the Mujahideen. Soviet influence in Afghanistan was targeted almost solely on the urban upper class. The vast majority of the population remained conservative and Muslim, so that when the communists took over, they saw their policies as an attack on their religion and culture rather than incoming progress. With most members of the PDPA being former students of the Soviet Union's Marxism-Leninism, the Soviet Union was more than willing to support their former students by providing political, economic, and military support. As the PDPA continued to fail to subdue the Mujahideen, the Soviet Union continued to be willing to escalate their support of the PDPA, mainly to safeguard communist efforts and to ensure that their loyalists maintained positions of power in the face of overwhelming odds. Furthermore, this desire to support their own former students is seen most clearly in their removal of Hafizullah Amin, a senior member of the PDPA who had not studied in the Soviet Union and someone who was seen as a hindrance by the Soviets, and his replacement by Babrak Karmal, someone who had studied in the Soviet Union. Lastly, when viewing the economic relationship between the USSR and Afghanistan, we find that Soviet-Afghan trade came to account for about 70 to 80% of Afghanistan's total trade. The Soviets had been investing millions of dollars into Afghanistan, taking a lead role in the development of the country's roads, airfields, railroads, mining industry, gas pipelines, and more. This economic expansion into Afghanistan was part of an overall strategy to expand the presence of communism, and when the PDPA was on the brink of collapse, the Soviet leadership may have felt as if they needed to step in and prop up the regime in order to safeguard their previous investments. It is important to note here that power is still an important part of a constructivist understanding of international relations. The difference between constructivists and realists lies in their placement of emphasis, with the former laying less emphasis on power than the latter. As we just saw, for the constructivist, the historic movements and institutions between the Soviet Union and Afghanistan set the groundwork for the invasion, with power acting as a corollary reason. Realism relies on the assumption that power is the main driving factor in international relations. As such, realists claim that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan due to their leadership's belief that they had more than the necessary power and capabilities to take on Afghanistan, and that they would gain strategically, increasing their power and advantages in the greater scheme of the Cold War. Their beliefs, unfortunately for them, were far from reality. Part of the reason that the Soviets were so confident in their own abilities is due to the large influx of oil wealth that came in during the time period. In 1979, crude oil prices increased from $17.50 a barrel to $40 a barrel, all the while the USSR's production of crude oil totaled around 12 million barrels a day. What resulted was an addition of tens of billions of dollars to the Soviet economy in a relatively short period of time, a strengthening of the Soviets' treasury, and an emboldening of the Soviet leadership's outlook of potential interventions into Afghanistan due to their newly reinforced belief of increased power and means. What resulted was a perception of strength that was much larger than reality. Another way to look at it is that the Soviets were correct in their belief that they had sufficient power. The Soviets were able to invade Afghanistan, install their own puppet government, and maintain control of most, if not all, major cities. The issue arises when the war transitioned from invasion to occupation, the latter of which requires vastly different tactics and capabilities than the former. What we can say then is that the Soviet Union had enough power for the invasion part of the equation, but failed to take into consideration the occupation part of the equation. With their focus only being on the invasion itself, they were more than confident enough in their own abilities. However, had they considered what a longer-term, drawn-out conflict in Afghanistan would mean, they may have had second thoughts about the invasion. Considering all of this, what then would the Soviets have gained strategically in a grab to increase their overall power if they were able to occupy and subdue Afghanistan successfully? First, and most obvious, is the expansion of the sphere of communism further into Central Asia and opening the potential path into South Asia. This goal in itself is not of Soviet origin, but something that originated a century prior during the time of the Russian Empire and acted as the focal point between the Russian Empire and the British Empire in their Great Game. Afghanistan acted as the buffer between the immense wealth of the British Empire's crown jewel, India, and the hostile expansionary force of the Russian Empire, with the Russian Empire constantly trying to exert their influence into Afghanistan in order to establish a foothold for their hoped eventual expansion into South Asia. With the newly established Indian state already leaning towards the communist bloc, although simultaneously attempting to maintain neutrality for the same reasons that Afghanistan did, the establishment of a land corridor between the USSR and India would have been extremely beneficial for both sides, not only for material reasons, but also, in the case of the USSR, for the reason of ideological expansion. Influence in Afghanistan would simultaneously allow Afghanistan to act as a strong and friendly buffer state between the USSR and the US's sphere of influence in Pakistan, securing the geopolitical situation of the Soviets and, in the process, allowing them to take more risks with little worry of the situation back home. The second strategic reason for invasion has to do with the increase of relative power. Relative power refers to the comparison of the increases or decreases of the power of other states when certain actions are taken. For example, the USSR may have invaded Afghanistan under the assumption that they may lose some power, but they would lose less power than other states that would attempt to reduce the influence of communism in Afghanistan. We can see this sort of reasoning influence the decision-making of the US government with regards to sending materials and training to Mujahideen fighters in Afghanistan, knowing that it would cost millions, if not billions of dollars, but that it would cause the USSR to lose relatively more than they did themselves. This sort of analysis is not only extremely useful in understanding the past, but also serves to help explain current events. I can see many parallels between the Soviet-Afghan War and the current Russian invasion of Ukraine. The citation of past historical and social relationships, as well as the perceived imbalance of power between the much stronger Russian state and the weak Ukrainian state, are some of the reasons for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Had Putin been a keener student of history, he may have avoided repeating the past. In all, what we find is a plethora of ideas surrounding the decision-making process that ultimately led to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. An invasion that has blown a stable and strong country into the depths of poverty, famine, and suffering. While no one single theory or strand of reasoning can explain away such a complex phenomenon as war, it is nonetheless useful to consolidate all the different lines of thinking and to examine them as a whole. Constructivists and realists are probably closer to the truth when unifying their assumptions and ways of thinking than when they pit them against each other. The middle path, or synergy of some sorts, oftentimes leads one closer to the truth than outright extremism.